Jade, don't you dare ruin the vibe today with that pathetic single woman desperation of yours. Harrison hissed, his voice a low, vibrating blade. He didn't even look me in the eye as he blocked the grand mahogany entrance to the Hamptons estate. The November wind off the Atlantic was brutal, but his words were colder. He shoved a crumpled plastic bag into my chest. Isabella's parents are inside. They are people of pedigree, people of substance. We can't have your struggling freelancer energy tainting the main table. Use the service entrance. And Savannah, if the lobster is even a second overcooked, you'll be paying me back for every dime I've invested in your life. I stared at the bag. Inside was a cheap $10 black polyester catering uniform, thin enough to see through, and an apron stained with someone else's old grease. I paid for the lobster, Harrison, I said, my voice trembling not from the cold, but from the sheer, staggering weight of his audacity. $12,000 of my own money is sitting in that kitchen right now. I bought the vintage Cristal. I hired the florists. Harrison checked his gold Rolex, the one I'd bought him for his 55th birthday, and sneered. Consider it back rent for the childhood I provided after your mother died. Now, get to the kitchen. The help doesn't use the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a final judgment. I stood on the porch of the house my mother built, the house she had intended for me, holding a uniform meant for a servant. I am Jade, 30 years old, the founder of one of the most aggressive marketing firms in Manhattan. I manage million-dollar budgets and navigate corporate shark tanks for breakfast. But the moment I step onto this property, my resume evaporates. To Harrison, I wasn't a daughter. I was a line item, an asset to be liquidated. I walked around to the service entrance, my boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. The kitchen was a cold, gleaming monument of stainless steel and marble. It was sterile, silent, and filled with the $12,000 worth of premium inventory I had personally sourced. "You're late starting the prep," Aunt Beatrice barked the moment I stepped inside. She didn't offer a greeting or a coat. She just scanned the counters for a flaw. "Isabella's family is already judging the centerpiece. We need this to go flawlessly. Your father is under enough stress with this engagement. Don't be your usual difficult self." "I paid for every scrap of food in this room, Beatrice," I said, slamming my bag onto the counter. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "And he raised you alone," she fired back, playing the family's favorite card, the one they'd used to bleed me dry for a decade. "He sacrificed his entire life for you. The least you can do is ensure he's happy today." "Don't be so transactional, Jade. It's unbecoming." Transactional. The word felt like a slap. For years, I had asked myself why I kept writing the checks, why I showed up to be insulted, why I let them treat me like an inconvenience they were forced to tolerate. I used to think it was because I was a good person. But standing there, looking at that pathetic polyester uniform, I finally saw the truth. It was a psychological trap. When you grow up in a house where affection is a currency, you don't learn to love, you learn to pay rent. Harrison hadn't raised a daughter. He had trained a staff member. Every time he withheld a "proud of you" until I opened my wallet, he was conditioning me. He taught me that my value wasn't innate. It was something I had to lease month by month with my labor and my silence. They had normalized the pain so slowly that I didn't realize I was bleeding until I was anemic. I wasn't here because of family loyalty. I was here because I was an addict, and his approval was the drug I'd been chasing since I was 6 years old. Beatrice watched me, waiting for the familiar slump of my shoulders, waiting for me to apologize and shrink. Instead, I picked up the black polyester apron. I tied the strings around my waist, pulling them so tight it hurt. A shift happened in my chest. A cold, mechanical click, like a lock snapping shut. If they wanted me to be the help, I would be the help. But they forgot the golden rule of the service industry. The help expects to be paid, and if the client violates the contract, the help has every right to walk off the job. "I'll have the appetizers out in 15 minutes, I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. Beatrice nodded, satisfied that she had put me back in my box. She turned and swept out of the kitchen, her silk dress hissing against the floor. She didn't see the look in my eyes. She didn't know that she hadn't just spoken to her niece. She had just spoken to a debt collector who was about to audit the entire account, and the interest rates were about to skyrocket. The guests arrived like a tidal wave of arrogance, a fleet of black Escalades and Range Rovers disgorging people wrapped in fur and smelling of old money entitlement. These were Isabella's people, the East Coast elite who looked at service staff as if they were part of the plumbing, useful but invisible. I moved through the grand foyer with a heavy silver tray of Wagyu beef crostini, my head bowed. In this house, wearing this $10 polyester rag, I had become a ghost. I watched Harrison from the corner of my eye. He was stationed by the fireplace, a glass of $400 Cabernet in his hand, wine I had personally sourced and paid for. He looked every bit the benevolent patriarch. "I had this vintage flown in specifically for tonight," Harrison lied, his voice booming. "Nothing but the best for Isabella. You know me. I don't cut corners for family." I gripped the tray until my knuckles turned white. He wasn't just stealing my money, he was stealing my identity. He was building his new life on the bricks of my labor while I stood 5 feet away, serving his friends like a stranger. Then Isabella drifted over. She was a vision in cream silk, her eyes sharp and predatory. "Harrison, darling," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "I thought you said your daughter was coming. I was so looking forward to meeting the rising star of Manhattan." The room went quiet. I froze. This was it, the moment of truth. Would he acknowledge me? Harrison let out a short, dismissive chuckle. He didn't beckon me over. Instead, he pointed his wine glass at me, not as a father points to a child, but as a homeowner points to a stain on the carpet. "Oh, that's her," he said, loud enough for all 45 guests to hear. "She's helping out today. Poor thing's little marketing business in the city is struggling. You know how the economy is. I told her she could work off some of her mounting debts by handling the service for us. We try to help family where we can, right?" A ripple of pitying laughter moved through the crowd. Isabella tilted her head, her expression shifting to mild distaste as she looked at my cheap uniform. "Oh," she murmured with a smirk. "That's very generous of you, Harrison. It's important to teach her the value of work, even if she lacks the talent to succeed." I didn't drop the tray, but inside, the last thread of the good daughter snapped. He had erased my existence to look like a saint. I walked back into the kitchen, the humiliation crystallizing into something sharp and lethal. I was staring at the prep table when Harrison stormed in, his mask of benevolence gone. "Pick up the pace, Jade," he hissed. "The second course is late. It looks unprofessional." He slammed a crumpled envelope onto the counter. "And take care of this. The property manager called. The backup generator needs a $2,500 emergency fee before the storm hits. Isabella likes the house at exactly 72 degrees. You want me to pay for the heat, Harrison?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "Consider it your contribution," he snapped, turning back to the door. "Since you didn't bring an engagement gift. Now move. The lobster won't serve itself." The door swung shut. Thump, thump, thump. I reached into my pocket and dialed the property management line. "This is Jade Vance," I said, my voice steady. "Regarding the estate at 110 Ocean Drive. Cancel the emergency service for the generator. Let the grid fail." I hung up and grabbed a black marker. I wrote a $20,000 invoice on a piece of cardstock and taped it to the fridge. Services suspended for non-payment. I took off the apron and placed my mother's house keys on top of it. I wasn't the help anymore. I was the collection agency. And I was about to seize every asset in this house. I didn't rush. Panic is for people who are stealing, and I wasn't stealing. I moved with the cold, surgical efficiency of a repo man reclaiming a defaulted luxury car. I walked out the service door into the biting Atlantic wind. My heavy-duty Ford truck, usually used for hauling marketing displays and event gear, sat idling in the shadows. I backed it right up to the loading ramp, the tires crunching over the fresh frost. The backup alarm beeped, a sharp, rhythmic warning that was swallowed by the roar of the ocean. I headed back inside. Through the swinging doors, I could hear the muffled laughter of 45 people enjoying a party I had funded. They were warm. They were hungry. They had no idea the supply chain had just been severed at the neck. First, the wine. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the 3 cases of vintage Cristal and the Cabernet Harrison had bragged about. These were $8,000 of liquid assets. I stacked them on a dolly and wheeled them out, loaded. Next, the proteins. The lobster tails were still in their thermal crates, and the dry-aged tomahawk steaks sat ready for the grill. $3,000 of prime beef. I didn't care that the guests were waiting for their main course. I grabbed the crates and hauled them to the truck. Loaded. Then came the truffles, the caviar, the artisanal cheeses, and even the hand-pressed linens I had selected to match the aesthetic Isabella demanded. I stripped the prep stations. I cleared the walk-in fridge. I even took the silver serving platters. Every single one belonged to my firm. It took exactly 15 minutes. When I was finished, the kitchen wasn't just empty. It was skeletal. The industrial stainless steel counters gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting nothing. No food, no warmth, no daughter. Just the invoice taped to the refrigerator, white and stark against the steel. Services suspended. I stood in the center of the room for a final second. This kitchen had been the site of so many holidays where I had worked myself to exhaustion, desperate for a seat at a table that was never meant for me. I realized now that the table didn't matter. The only real power I ever had was the ability to walk away from it. I grabbed my coat and my car keys. I didn't look back as I walked out the service door and locked it behind me. I climbed into the cab of my truck, the heater blasting. As I pulled away from the estate, I felt a physical release in my chest. My shoulders dropped. The knot in my stomach, which had been there for a decade, finally uncoiled. I had canceled the emergency generator service 10 minutes ago. Based on the storm reports, the main power grid would fail within the hour. Without the generator, the HVAC system would die. That stone and glass mansion would turn into an icebox in the middle of a coastal blizzard. This wasn't cruelty. It was accounting. Harrison had spent 30 years taking the warmth from my life to fuel his own ego. Now, for the first time, he was going to feel exactly what it was like to be left out in the cold. I navigated the winding, ice-slicked roads away from the Hamptons, the truck's tires gripping the pavement with more certainty than I had felt in years. I checked into a generic motel 20 miles away, locked the door, and finally looked at my phone. It was 7:30 p.m. The power at the estate had likely just gone out. The screen exploded. 30 missed calls from Harrison, 12 from Aunt Beatrice. A string of texts from Isabella that started with, "Where are the hors d'oeuvres?" and ended with, "You are a dead woman." I didn't reply. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, listening to the wind howl outside, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly warm. But the night wasn't over. Harrison was a man who didn't know how to lose, and I knew he would try to burn the world down before he let me win. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers strobed against the motel's dirty snow, painting the walls of my room in a rhythmic, haunting glow. I wasn't surprised. Harrison was a man who viewed the law as a personal concierge service. If he couldn't shame me into submission, he would use handcuffs to do it. I opened the door before they could even knock. 2 officers stood there, their hands resting on their belts, while Harrison loomed behind them. He looked pathetic. His expensive tuxedo was disheveled, and his face was a mask of calculated grief. He wasn't the benevolent patriarch anymore. He was a man who had lost his audience and his dinner. "That's her," Harrison shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She stole everything, not just the catering, but family heirlooms, jewelry, thousands of dollars in property. She's unstable, officer. She had a mental breakdown and ransacked my home." He looked at me, a cruel, triumphant glint in his eyes. He leaned in closer, whispering so the officers couldn't hear. "Return the inventory, finish the dinner, and apologize to Isabella's father, or you're going to spend the night in a cell. Jail or servitude, Jade. Your choice." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt pity. He was still trying to use the same old psychological leash, but I had already cut the leather. "Officer," I said, my voice as cold as the ice on the windshields, "you're welcome to search the truck, but before you do, you should look at these." I handed them a thick folder of receipts, every single invoice for the lobster, the wine, the linens, and the silver. "I am a professional event planner. Everything in that truck was purchased with my corporate card. I am not stealing. I am recovering company assets from a client who defaulted on his payment. It's a civil matter, not a criminal one." The lead officer scanned the receipts, then looked at Harrison. "Mr. Vance, these receipts are in her name. If she bought the items, she has the right to take them." "She stole the jewelry!" Harrison roared, his voice cracking. "My late wife's diamonds are missing." "Check the dash cam in my truck, officer," I replied calmly. "It's been recording the service ramp since I arrived. I never entered the main house's private quarters. I only clear kitchen. My father is making a false police report, which is a criminal offense." The officer's expression hardened as he turned back to Harrison. The grieving father act was falling apart under the weight of documented facts. Harrison began to stammer, his face turning a deep, sickly purple. "But that's not the best part," I continued, pulling a final document from the folder. "Officer, I'd like to report a trespasser, specifically at 110 Ocean Drive." Harrison laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You're delusional. I live there. I have a life estate." "You had a life estate," I corrected him, stepping forward until I was inches from his face. "Section 4, Clause B of Mom's trust deed. You were granted the right to live in that house as long as you remained a widower and didn't use the property for commercial gain, or to host hostile interests against the primary beneficiary, me." I tapped the paper. "The moment you announced your engagement to Isabella and tried to force me to work as an unpaid servant to secure a business merger with her family, you violated the terms. This house hasn't been yours since you stepped onto that porch today and handed me that polyester apron. You're not my father tonight, Harrison. You're a tenant whose lease just expired." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind howled, but Harrison was frozen. He looked at the document, then at the police officers, who were now looking at him with professional suspicion. "I've already filed the emergency eviction notice with my lawyers," I said. my voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "The power is out, the food is gone, and the police are right here. You have 20 minutes to pack a bag before they escort you and your high society guests off my property." Harrison's mouth hung open, but no words came out. The hunter had finally stepped into his own trap. The 20 minutes I gave Harrison were the longest and most satisfying moments of my life. I didn't stay at the motel. I followed the police cruisers back to the estate, sitting in the warm cab of my truck, watching the drama unfold through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the darkened mansion. Without the generator, the house had surrendered to the elements. Inside, the high society guests were no longer elegant. I saw Isabella wrapped in a hideous yellow emergency blanket, her face twisted in a snarl as she screamed at Harrison. Her parents, the people of pedigree, were scrambling to find their designer luggage in the dark, using their iPhones as flashlights. The vibe Harrison was so terrified I would ruin had been replaced by a scene of frigid, chaotic desperation. The police stood by the door, impassive, as they watched the elite of the East Coast stumble out into the freezing mud. Harrison was the last to leave. He carried 2 mismatched suitcases, his tuxedo jacket ruined by the sleet. As he passed my truck, I rolled down the window. The cold air hit me, but I didn't flinch. "Jade, please," he croaked, his voice stripped of its booming authority. "It's 20 degrees out here. You can't do this. We're family." "Family brings their own coat, Harrison," I said, repeating the hard lesson he had taught me through decades of neglect. "You didn't want a daughter today. You wanted a contractor. And as a contractor, I've completed the audit. The account is settled. You have no credits left." He tried to step toward the truck, but one of the officers placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Move along, Mr. Vance. The owner has requested you vacate the premises immediately." I watched his taillights vanish into the blinding white sheet of the blizzard. For the first time in 30 years, the air in my lungs felt clean. 6 months later, the Hamptons estate was a memory, or rather, a massive deposit in my investment account. I sold the property the moment the legal dust settled. I didn't want to live in a monument to my mother's grief and my father's greed. I used the capital to move my firm into a glass-walled penthouse in Soho and establish the Vance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal and financial resources for women escaping domestic and psychological abuse. I learned that the normalized cruelty Harrison had practiced was a shadow that only grew if you stood still. The moment you start walking, the shadow loses its power. My phone buzzed on my desk. A text from an unknown number, Harrison. He had been living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Jersey City, his engagement to Isabella having lasted exactly 3 hours after the power went out. "Jade, I'm sick. The doctors say it's stress. I need help with the medical bills. After everything I did for you." I stared at the screen. A year ago, this message would have sent me into a spiral of guilt. I would have called his doctor, paid the bill, and apologized for being a bad daughter. But as I looked at the words, I felt nothing. Not anger, not hatred, just a profound, hollow emptiness. I didn't block him this time. I wanted the message to stay there as a reminder of the price of freedom. I simply deleted the thread and went back to my work. I used to think family meant burning yourself alive to keep others warm. I used to think my value was measured in the size of the checks I wrote and the silence I maintained. I was wrong. My value is measured by the boundaries I set and the respect I command. The professional event planner in me still knows how to host a perfect evening. But now, the guest list is exclusive. You don't get a seat at my table just because of your DNA. You get a seat because you bring kindness integrity, and your own light. As for Harrison, he finally got what he wanted. He's no longer burdened by a daughter who doesn't fit his aesthetic. He's alone with his memories and his cheap polyester regrets. I stood up and looked out over the Manhattan skyline. The sun was setting, painting the city in hues of gold and amber. I was Jade Vance. I was 31 years old. I was the CEO of my own life, and for the first time, the books were perfectly balanced. Stop setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. Family should be your support, not your shadow. Set your boundaries and choose yourself first. If they truly cared, they'd bring you a coat instead of leaving you out in the cold. Thanks for watching. If this story hit home, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.